The annual Spring Church Fete is a highlight in my calendar. Every year, all the community of Port Galia, even Rodney Cole, get together to celebrate the start of spring in the port by selling various homemade items, playing games and having friendly competitions. Well, I say friendly, but in truth, not all of the competitions are always friendly. Specifically, the pie baking competition between the women of Port Galia. You see, each year it is hotly contested, with everyone doing their best to come up with a pie that stands out from the others. But each year, one woman of the community, specifically Mrs. Fenchurch, seemed to snatch first place. I can recall it all began when all the women of the community were discussing the upcoming competition, as Helen Doris had just closed a meeting of the Women's Book Club. I can also remember how the conversation got rather heated much too quickly. It was Mrs. Cole who'd began the discussion as she gathered her books in her arms, put on her blue polka dot coat and exclaimed,
"Well, ladies, the pie baking competition is on Sunday. Who's going to win this year, do you think?"
"Most probably Mrs. Fenchurch, I imagine,"
Janet Davies replied flatly, downing her last drop of tea.
"She won it the past 3 years, so I don't really see as much point in trying."
Don't be that way, Janet. I may have won the last 3 years, but each competition is a new one. You never know. You could beat me this time.
"Oh, no.
Patsy interjected loudly.
I'm going to win this one, I'm sure. I've been practicing all winter with different flavours and ingredients, and I just know that Harry will choose mine this year."
But you see, Harry's a part of the problem.
Mrs. Davies butt in rudely.
I hardly think that's fair that Primrose's husband is the judge. I mean, after all, aren't judges supposed to be unbiased? And doesn't it seem odd to you all that the winner's husband has been the judge for the past 3 years?
Primrose seemed hurt by Janet's pointed questions and replied quite firmly.
My husband never knows who's whose, Janet. I'm very careful not to allow him in the kitchen when I'm making my pies. And besides all that, Harry is perfectly fair to choose which pie he likes best, not which competitor.
I'm not so sure you're not bribing him behind the scenes.
"Now, ladies,"
Helen, the local doctor, said from the other side of the table, standing to her feet.
"there is no need to get yourself into a row over it. Now, I'm not involved in all this pie baking business, and quite frankly, I'm glad I'm not. But I really don't see a need for so much fussing. At the end of the day, it's just a ribbon. Can't you all just wait and see who wins like sensible adults?"
"You're right, Mrs. Doris. Perfectly right."
Donna Thomas agreed in her almost always fair and reasonable tone.
"After all, it's anyone's game, as they say. I feel as though even I could have a chance to win this year."
"And why is that, Miss Thomas?" I asked, joining the discussion and doing my best not to be impolite. I mean, I don't mean to be rude, but you haven't won before, Donna, and well, baking has never been your strongest area of talent.
"Oh, believe me, I'm most aware of that, Betty. More than anyone, I can assure you. When I used to live in London with my brother, he made a pie that would knock the socks off all our house guests. So this year, I had the idea to give him a call, and amazingly, he gave me the recipe for it. Now the only hurdle I must endure to get over is making it."
I'm sure it will be fabulous, Donna. May the best baker win.
Which would be you, of course.
"Janet!"
I'm sorry, but I just don't think it's worth all this effort with Primrose doing deals under the table.
"Mrs. Davies," I exclaimed, shocked by Janet's boldness. "That is quite an accusation to make against Primrose, and I do hope you have proof to back it up."
3 ribbons is all the proof I feel is needed.
Janet stood up from the table and stormed off in a huff, closing the door of the church hall firmly behind her. Primrose was astonished by her sudden outburst, and frankly, so was everyone else. Patsy swung her bag over her arm and shook her head in disbelief.
"My stars. Who put a burr in her bloomers? Sorry about that, Primrose. I know Janet can be difficult at times, but I haven't seen her fly off like that before."
Don't worry, Patsy.
She replied, gathering her things and making for the door.
It's all right. I won't mind it. I'll just do my best, and if I win, I win. And if I lose, I lose. And I can promise you all there will be no cheating involved either way.
We know that, Primrose. Don't you worry. We know you're fair.
Primrose left the room, and the others of us packed up our books and headed out into the spring air. It was Monday, and the evening was drawing in as the sun dipped low into the blue-green sea to close another day. When I returned home, I told my dear husband, who is the Reverend of Port Galia, about all that occurred, and he was most shocked indeed. You see, Mrs. Davies is the owner of the corner shop along with her husband Patrick, and usually she is kind and polite, a little particular and flustered at times, but usually quite a nice sort of lady. So for such an outburst to occur, she must have been awfully upset about it, and it was clear that she was. Well, during the week, the women of the community were busier than ever in their kitchens, prepping and boiling and mixing fillings and crumbling and crimping and rolling pastry like their name depended on it. Even I found myself getting a little too excited over it all, and spending less time helping my dear Harley type out his sermon and preparing for Sunday school, and more time perfecting my recipe I thought had a chance at winning the competition. It was a rhubarb and apple pie with a both crisp and crumbly short crust pastry laid on top and crimped elegantly at the sides. I had practiced it 5 times by the time Sunday rolled around, and even Harley, who had a natural sweet tooth, was getting quite bored with the same pudding every day. Well, once service had concluded that morning, the community was in full fete swing. Stalls were put up in the churchyard, sack races and ring-tossing games were laid out, and the all-important long judging table for the pie contest was set, with a very familiar blue and red checkered tablecloth draped over the top. Soon, after all the women, including myself, had retrieved the pies baked the night before and placed them down on the cloth, the competition began, and Mr. Fenchurch stepped up to the table with a very large smile on his face. Being a man of a fairly large equator, it was quite clear he enjoyed his food. Us ladies stood in a line beside the table, eagerly keeping our keen eyes on our pies and watching for his response. Mrs. Davies looked especially focused on her pie. So much, in fact, she completely ignored all of us when we tried to engage in conversation with her. Mr. Fenchurch scooped a spoonful from her pie, and she watched him intently without saying a word, as to not give away whose pie was whose.
That's an interesting one, that,
he remarked with a raised eyebrow.
Very interesting indeed. Don't think I've ever had one like that before.
Janet observed his expressions carefully, and I could tell by the look on her face she wasn't pleased with his response. He set that spoon down and then moved on to Patsy's pie, and shoveled in a good deal of it in one gulp.
Good gravy! Now that's a high-ranking pie. Could be a winner.
Did you hear that, Primrose?
Patsy whispered excitedly, leaning across to her friend.
He said I could be the winner.
I know, that's very exciting, isn't it? Oh, look, he's about to try mine.
Harry looked at Primrose's pie and then bent down and sniffed it long and hard. Then he stood up and looked at us with a smile.
Rotten rumps! That does smell odd. What's in this one, I wonder?
Harry put in his spoon, took a large chunk out and swirled it around in his mouth.
That's delicious. What a pie. What a wonder. What a strange aftertaste. I like it.
Janet rolled her eyes and glared across at Primrose spitefully. Primrose didn't see it, but I did. And I must admit to my shame, I glared back. I know. I'm the Reverend's wife and I should set the example. But I was getting more than a trifle frustrated with Janet's attitude, and I couldn't help but show it. Finally, Harry reached Donna's pie. Donna told me she had been slaving over it every moment she could get away from work at the school, desperately trying to imitate her brother's recipe. She watched in anticipation and chewed her lip quite ferociously as he took a spoonful of her pie and swallowed. At first, he coughed, and then he spluttered, and then he coughed and spluttered at the same time. Donna didn't look like she could take it, and was about to open her mouth to see if he was all right, when all of a sudden, he stopped coughing and spluttering, and began humming a tune of delight. He looked at us all with the biggest smile so far and said,
Well, call me a sausage and season my steak. That's the greatest pie I've ever had in my life. First prize for sure.
Really, Harry?
Donna exclaimed, giving herself away with her brown eyes nearly popping out of socket with shock.
Do you mean it? Do you really mean it?
I most certainly do. That is a champion pie. Who would have thought it? Putting chilli in an apple pie. It was chilli, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. I can't believe it.
Well, let me see if this will help you believe it better.
Harry took the bright blue ribbon rosette out his pocket and put it on her pie with a smile.
Miss Thomas, congratulations. You've won this year's Spring Church Fete Pie Baking Competition.
Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you.
Congratulations, Donna. You deserve it.
Yes, 3 cheers for you, Donna. Putting chilli in an apple pie is something I'd never have thought of. But if I know one thing about my Harry, it's that he likes his spicy food, so you've hit the nail on the head with this one.
Well, it is my brother's recipe, so really the credit should go to him.
Oh no, you made it. You get the credit, my dear. After all the hard work you put in to make it, you're the one that deserves the round of applause.
Yes, quite right.
Helen piped up from the group that had gathered to watch.
And a round of applause she will get. Well done, Donna. You should be proud of yourself. Shouldn't she, Janet?
Janet Davies looked at Helen with an awkward and angry expression and walked up to Donna with a forced half smile.
Yes, well, I suppose a congratulations is in order. Well done.
Thank you, Janet.
Didn't quite work out the way you thought it would, did it? Primrose didn't win, and neither did you, if you don't mind me saying. So let's not be so quick to judge who's cheating next time, eh?
I couldn't help but chuckle at that, and neither could some of the other ladies. After all that fuss, neither Primrose or Janet won. It was in fact the unassuming schoolteacher who clinched it. Some of her students came running up to her and smiled in congratulations. Little Jack Doris, Helen's son, grabbed her hand and shook it formally.
A sterling job, Miss Thomas. A jolly good show.
Yes, Miss Thomas.
Molly agreed, running up beside her brother.
A very good show indeed. You really pulled it out of the bag this year.
Especially given the plane crash you presented last year.
Jack, don't be rude.
Sorry, I didn't mean to be. Do forgive me, Miss Thomas.
No offence is taken, Jack. Now, would you like to try some of my pie? I can't let it go to waste now, can I?
Just Jack?
Of course not. You can try it too.
Gee, thanks, Miss Thomas.
I may indulge in some more myself if you don't mind, Miss Thomas.
I don't, but I wonder if your wife might, Mr. Fenchurch.
Primrose looked at him and shook her head with a laugh.
Oh, all right then, have some more. I suppose you only get to judge this competition once a year.
And so, with that, Mr. Fenchurch shoveled lots more of the pie, and not just Miss Thomas's either. He made his way down the line, spooning in mouth after mouthful, much to the amusement of the community that watched him. And so, that spring, all of us were shocked by the winner of the pie baking competition, and no one more shocked than Mrs. Davies herself, who after that day had to eat some of her own humble pie.
In this episode of Port Galia, Mrs. Davies learnt a valuable lesson. A lesson in not judging others. She was certain that Mrs. Fenchurch had been cheating and that she was going to win the spring pie baking competition once again. But it turns out that she was not only sorely mistaken, but left to eat her own humble pie. We can learn from her mistake by not jumping to conclusions and by listening to what the Bible has to say in James 1:19. So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. This means that before you go making accusations about somebody, you should think about what you're saying and be willing to hear them out before you lose your cool and make a wrong assumption. So today, don't do what Mrs. Davies did, but listen to what the Bible says instead. And in doing so, you'll save yourself from a lot of embarrassment.